Greetings, I'm Laura Puccia Valtorta. Welcome to episode 26 of my podcast of short stories, B is for Bisexual. Today we're going back to the wild boar stories because people seem to like that, and the episode is called Wild Boar Trip to Portofino. I am a content creator, writer, and filmmaker, also an attorney in my spare time. I want to remind you about the novel entitled Redemption, written by my friend Carolyn Hartley. It's an historical fiction piece about the coal mining community in West Virginia in the 1930s and 40s. I hope you all pick up a copy on Amazon. And also on Amazon are my films, Bermuda, Disability Queen of the Road, The Art House, and my collection of short stories, Tall, Sarcastic Tales. Also, check out the channel Tubi. They now have my feature-length film Bermuda and the short film Disability, and they are getting ready to pick up the Disease Detective series with 2 episodes. I'm very excited about that. Tubi is a great channel for creators. Joining me in the reading of my short story, Wild Boar Trip to Portofino, are Marco, a computer scientist.
Hi.
And Dante, a musician.
Hello.
And now let's visit Portofino. At the Castello guest house in the mountains during April, 4-month-old Alberto, detto Alvin, woke up crying at 6 a.m. Compared to other days, Stefano felt like they had gotten a good night's sleep. The sun was rising and birds were shouting in the trees. Renata's hair was shaved off on both sides for simplicity, and her eyes were squeezed shut.
Oh, let's take the children on a trip to Portofino,
said Stefano.
Alvin is getting old enough. And Rennie will sure enjoy the view.
Yabba, said Renata despondently. You could put Alvin in the carrier. I'm not lugging him around. With a baby in the house and a law practice to run, Renata was grumpy all the time, despite their convenient childcare setup. Paid parental leave, available in Italy, was over for both of them. During the week, both Renata Jr., called Rennie, and Alvin stayed with Stefano's sisters and his ex-girlfriend Claudia in the mountains. Stefano sometimes took Rennie with him to his Farinata restaurant, but there was no time for anybody to relax.
And Chiara could come along to help,
said Stefano. She's head of the coven now, said Renata. You're more likely to convince Elena and Claudia to help us. Elena Jr., the oldest sibling in the Castello family, had recently moved out of the guest house to shack up with Claudia, Stefano's ex-girlfriend. Claudia was a postal carrier who had remodeled her house after her parents died. It was slick and modern, with 2 large marble-tiled bathrooms and a barn for coven meetings. Chiara, Elena Jr., and Claudia were all witches.
I'm not inviting them,
said Stefano, frowning. After a quick breakfast, Renata and Stefano left Rennie sleeping with her aunt and took Alvin for a walk in the woods. Alvin fell asleep in the baby carrier. They stopped at the spot under the pine tree where cinghiali usually gathered to feast on pine nuts. Stefano was not surprised to see a family of wild boars snuffling at the ground. They're not even afraid of us, said Renata, sitting on a log. Stefano said nothing. He was ashamed and frightened to think that these animals considered him a compadre and almost a member of their family. The biggest boar stared at him, smiled a little, and went back to snuffling up the pine nuts. Back at the guest house, Rennie was at the table screaming for her mother. Chiara, making toast, was shaking her head.
The princess has decided this morning she doesn't like albicocche. Every other day it's been fruit, fruit, fruit. Then Dad told her some crazy story about fruit filled with bugs.
Renata picked up her daughter and began to rock her frantically in the big chair. Rennie screamed harder. Her cheeks were red. Her jaw jutted forward. She looked like an animal.
Come on, get your clothes on,
said Stefano.
We're going to Portofino.
Immediately, Rennie's screams turned to shouts of approval.
Yay, yay, yay!
Even though she had never been to Portofino and complained whenever they strapped her into the car.
You won't be able to park,
said Chiara.
Tourists.
If we can't park,
said Stefano,
we'll turn around and drive home.
When they arrived at the Portofino city parking lot, the one surrounding the city, a big woman was just backing out of her spot. Renata zoomed in, blocking two men in a Volkswagen who had obviously been waiting for the spot. Renata was from Milan and knew how to score an open parking space. If the spot was bigger than a Cinquecento, Renata could park there. The yelling and cursing of the other driver, loud and apparently from the south, woke Alvin and Rennie up from their naps.
Disgraziata! Chi ti ha dato la patente? Testa di rapa!
Alvin started to cry. I'll give him a bottle, said Renata. We can all sit down at a restaurant to eat.
Oggi mangiamo nella macchina,
said Stefano.
And visit Castello Brown before the tourists descend from that ship.
He pointed to a giant yacht in the harbor. This is Portofino, said Renata. Tourists are everywhere.
I want to get ahead of them. I like their fat feet,
said Stefano. They bring in money. Renata closed her eyes and held Alvin while he drank his formula. Get out the sandwiches and the carrot sticks. Rennie seemed happy to dive into the picnic basket with her father until she saw the basket of blueberries.
No fruit,
she screamed. Stefano grabbed the blueberries and began stuffing them all into his mouth. Rennie glared at him.
Daddy will get sick. Nonno says so.
I am sick, all right,
he said.
Sick of you and Nonno.
He poked Rennie in the shoulder. Rennie smiled and settled down with a cheese sandwich and carrot sticks. Alvin slept in his car seat, and everybody else ate lunch. When they had finished the last panino, Stefano thought they should just go back home right then. But the idea of turning around was too foolish. Portofino was an hour from the Canelo's mountain home, but they rarely thought about visiting the place. This was a unique opportunity. He sighed and picked up the baby carrier. Alvin woke up and started screaming. He pooped loudly into his diaper. His sister laughed. I hate this kid, said Renata. It took her another 10 minutes to clean him and change him and throw away the detritus. Stefano wished sincerely for a lazy, work-free weekend without children. Finally, after what seemed like hours, they trudged across the piazza toward Castello Brown. Stefano remembered this house from visiting it with his mom 20 years earlier. She had been given a day off from the jewelers, and his sisters were in school. In those days, his dad worked as a carabiniere. For once, he had had his mother to himself. He remembered Castello Brown as paradise on top of a hill. There was a side path leading up to the castle, and the castle was really just a nice house in a pleasant location with an incredible view of the Mediterranean. The previous owners had donated it to the city. For a few minutes, they had the pathway to themselves. Renata was quiet and calm. Alvin felt almost light in the carrier. Rennie ran ahead and examined some pebbles on the side of the pathway. As soon as her parents caught up, she scampered ahead and examined the flowers or the paving stones. Don't touch those cacti, said her mother. A bunch of grammar school students burst upon them. They were chattering like mockingbirds and bouncing around like pinballs.
No,
said Stefano.
Oh, it was so quiet a minute ago.
The students rushed past them, talking and giggling. Rennie pointed at the older children, mesmerized. "Don't worry. Once we make it to the top, those students will be gone," said Renata. "They're so fast." Finally, the Canelos reached the top. The rooms in the house, open and cool, made the hot climb worth it. They listened for a moment to the guide, a short, nerdy fellow, and then stepped away from the group of American tourists and went out into the courtyard. Alvin was asleep, and Rennie was jumping around. The view from the courtyard was magnificent, blue and flowery. The yacht below looked like a giant toy. They could see down two sides of the mountain into the touristy harbor and toward the path to the hidden harbor of San Frutuoso, where scientists first discovered the immortal jellyfish that regenerates itself. Stefano needed some water. He took a bottle out of his backpack and glugged it down. Alvin opened his eyes and looked at his father. Stefano looked back, and he felt himself looking almost into Renata's eyes with their steadiness and calmness. He ruffled Alvin's hair and kissed him on the cheek. Up behind him marched the parade of American tourists with cameras, led by a large man wearing shorts and a baseball cap. His big fat feet had broken nails and toes that clenched leather flip-flops.
"Everybody, look at this view!"
shouted the man in English. He pushed past the Canelos, blocking Stefano's view of the harbor below. The American pastel family followed, including a dumpy wife and two greasy teenagers. Stefano felt his face heat up. His hair stiffened and his jaw jutted forward. Inside his hiking boots, he could feel the bottom of his feet hardening and his toes merging. His boots burst open. He let out a loud grunting sound, afraid he would drop the baby. Renata, who had been pointing out sights to their daughter, rushed over to grab Alvin out of the carrier, allowing Stefano to drop onto all fours, facing the Americans. His bottom teeth jutted forward and up, becoming weapons. The guide passed out, flat out onto the courtyard paving stones. The American dad screamed.
"What the? Everybody run!"
he shouted before rushing to the exit as fast as his flattened flip-flops would carry him. Most of the other tourists followed. One of the teenagers, newly energized, stayed behind to shoot a video on her phone. Renata stood hugging the baby, rocking him and staring at Stefano, shaking her head and saying, "Oh, mamma mia, over and over again. Rennie took her fingers out of her mouth and pointed at her father, smiling.
"That is funny."
Alvin, stuck in his mother's arms, squirmed around, craning his neck to look at his dad, an animal pawing the ground. The baby smiled broadly, and a staccato "ha ha ha" sound came out of his mouth. For the first time in his life, Alvin was laughing. And that's the end of this episode of the Wild Boar family. And I want to say thank you to Dante.
Thank you.
And to Marco.
You're welcome.
For helping. And we'll see you next month.